In the floodplain of the Mississippi River, 8 kilometers east of modern St. Louis, Missouri, there is a mound of earth that rises 30 meters above the surrounding farmland. It covers an area of more than 5.5 hectares at its base, larger than the footprint of the Great Pyramid of Giza. It contains an estimated 622,000 cubic meters of soil, every handful of which was carried to the site in woven baskets on the backs of human beings who had no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals, and no metal tools. It was built over a period of roughly 3 centuries, layer upon layer, terrace upon terrace, a mountain raised by human hands on a landscape where no mountains exist. It is the largest earthen structure in the Western Hemisphere, and one of the largest in the world. Its builders called it something that we will never know, because they left no written record of themselves or their works. The Europeans who later settled the region called it Monk's Mound, after a community of Trappist monks who briefly farmed its terraces in the early 19th century. The civilization that built it has no name at all, because the people who created it vanished centuries before the first Europeans set foot on the North American continent. Archaeologists call the site Cahokia, after a subtribe of the Illiniwek people who were living in the area when French explorers arrived in the late 1600s, but who had no connection to the builders of the mounds and no memory of who they were or why they had built what they built. Cahokia. The name refers to one of the most extraordinary and least known archaeological sites in the world. At its peak, around the year 1050 to 1150 of the Common Era, Cahokia was the largest settlement in North America north of Mexico, a city of 10,000 to 20,000 people, possibly more, spread across an area of more than 13 square kilometers, centered on a grand plaza that was among the largest public spaces in the ancient Americas. The city contained more than 120 earthen mounds of various sizes and shapes, arranged in a pattern that reflected a sophisticated understanding of astronomy, geometry, and urban planning. It was surrounded by a massive wood-hung palisade, a wall of logs that enclosed the central precinct of the city, and that was rebuilt at least 4 times during the city's history, each time requiring the felling and transport of thousands of trees. It was the hub of a trade network that extended from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, from the Appalachian Mountains to the Great Plains, a network through which flowed copper from the shores of Lake Superior, marine shell from the Gulf Coast, mica from the mountains of North Carolina, and chert from the quarries of southern Illinois. It was, by any reasonable measure, a city, an urban center of considerable size, complexity, and influence, and it flourished in the heart of the North American continent for more than 3 centuries before declining, and being abandoned sometime around 1300 of the Common Era, and almost nobody knows about it. The obscurity of Cahokia is one of the most remarkable failures of historical memory in the modern world. Here was a city that, at its peak, was larger than contemporary London, larger than most European cities of the same period, a city that organized thousands of people into a hierarchically structured society, capable of monumental construction on a scale that rivals anything in the pre-Columbian Americas. And yet Cahokia does not appear in the standard narratives of American history. It is not taught in most schools. It is not featured in most textbooks. It occupies no place in the popular imagination, comparable to the place occupied by the pyramids of Egypt, the temples of Greece, or the ruins of Rome. The largest pre-Columbian settlement north of Mexico, a city that flourished for 300 years, and then vanished so completely that even the people living nearby had forgotten its existence, has been reduced to a state historic site on the outskirts of East St. Louis, visited by a fraction of the tourists who visit Gettysburg or Mount Rushmore, known to specialists, and ignored by almost everyone else. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand what Cahokia was, how it rose, why it fell, and what its existence means for our understanding of North American history and the capacity of human beings to build complex societies in environments that seem, by the standards of the old world, unsuitable for urbanization. You are going to learn about the extraordinary engineering achievement represented by Monk's Mound, about the astronomical knowledge encoded in the wooden post circles that archaeologists call Woodhenge, about the disturbing evidence of human sacrifice found in the burial mound known as Mound 72, and about the trade networks that connected Cahokia to communities across half a continent. And you are going to confront a question that haunts every study of a vanished civilization, the question of how a society can be powerful enough to reshape the landscape, and yet fragile enough to disappear from memory within a few generations of its abandonment. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. The story of Cahokia is not merely an archaeological curiosity. It is a story about the capacity of indigenous North Americans to build something that the European colonizers of the continent refused to believe they had built. When the first European settlers encountered the mounds of the Mississippi Valley, they attributed them to a lost race of mound builders, a mythical civilization of superior beings, perhaps Israelites, perhaps Phoenicians, perhaps Vikings, who had constructed the mounds and then been destroyed or driven away by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples, whom the settlers found living in the region. The idea that the mounds had been built by the ancestors of the people living nearby, by the indigenous peoples of North America themselves, was too threatening to the ideological foundations of colonialism to be accepted. If the indigenous peoples of North America had built cities, organized complex societies, and engineered monumental architecture on a scale that rivaled European achievements, then the justification for dispossessing them, the claim that they were savages who had failed to make productive use of the land, was undermined at its root. The mound builder myth was not an innocent misunderstanding. It was an act of ideological erasure, a deliberate refusal to credit indigenous peoples with the capacity for civilization, a refusal that persisted in popular culture long after scholars had established beyond any doubt that the mounds were the work of the indigenous peoples of the Mississippi Valley. Now, let's begin. To understand Cahokia, we must first understand the landscape that made it possible, because the story of Cahokia is, at its deepest level, a story about the relationship between a people and a place, about how the specific geography, hydrology, and ecology of the central Mississippi Valley created the conditions for the emergence of the largest and most complex society in the pre-Columbian history of North America. The Mississippi River is the defining feature of the North American continent, a vast waterway that drains more than 3 million square kilometers of territory, collecting the waters of the Missouri, the Ohio, the Arkansas, the Red, and dozens of smaller tributaries, and carrying them southward through the heart of the continent to the Gulf of Mexico. The river is more than just a waterway. It is a transportation network, a source of fish and waterfowl, a creator of fertile floodplains, and a shaper of landscapes. The alluvial deposits left behind by millennia of flooding have created some of the richest agricultural land on the North American continent, deep, fertile soils that are renewed by periodic inundation, and that support intensive agriculture without the need for the elaborate irrigation systems that were required in the arid environments of the American Southwest and the coastal deserts of Peru. Cahokia is located in the American Bottom, a broad floodplain on the eastern side of the Mississippi River, directly across from the confluence of the Mississippi and the Missouri rivers. The American Bottom is a low-lying area of approximately 450 square kilometers, bounded by the Mississippi on the west and by the bluffs of the Illinois uplands on the east. In antiquity, the American Bottom was a landscape of extraordinary ecological diversity and biological productivity. The floodplain was laced with oxbow lakes, sloughs, marshes, and backwater channels that provided habitat for an enormous variety of fish, waterfowl, turtles, and other aquatic organisms. The upland forests on the bluffs above the floodplain contain deer, elk, bear, turkey, and other game animals. The prairies that extended to the north and east of the bluffs provided habitat for bison and other grassland species, and the soils of the floodplain itself, enriched by millennia of alluvial deposition, were among the most fertile in North America, capable of supporting intensive agriculture of the kind that would eventually sustain the population of Cahokia. The ecological richness of the American Bottom was a product of its position at the intersection of several major ecological zones, the confluence of the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Illinois rivers, all of which meet within a few dozen kilometers of the Cahokia site, created a landscape of unusual hydrological complexity, with multiple river channels, extensive wetlands, and a mosaic of aquatic and terrestrial habitats that supported a diversity of plant and animal species unmatched by any comparably sized area in the interior of the North American continent. The fish resources of the American bottom were particularly abundant. The oxbow lakes and backwater channels of the floodplain supported large populations of catfish, bass, drum, gar, and other freshwater species that could be harvested year-round using traps, weirs, nets, and hooks. The seasonal migrations of waterfowl, including ducks, geese, and cranes, brought enormous flocks through the American bottom during the spring and fall, providing a seasonal supplement to the diet that could be harvested with nets, snares, and bows. The nut-bearing trees of the upland forests, including hickory, oak, and black walnut, produced annual crops of high-calorie nuts that could be gathered in the fall and stored for winter consumption. This ecological abundance provided the wild resource base that supplemented the maize agriculture of the Cahokian period, and that had sustained the human populations of the American bottom for thousands of years before the adoption of maize. The peoples of the American bottom had been exploiting the wild resources of the floodplain for at least 10,000 years, developing specialized techniques for the harvest and processing of fish, waterfowl, shellfish, and plant foods that were refined over millennia and that continued to play an important role in the Cahokian economy, even after maize became the dominant staple. The transition from a predominantly foraging economy to a predominantly agricultural one was not a sudden break, but a gradual shift, in which maize supplemented and eventually replaced the wild plant foods that had been the staple of the earlier diet. While the wild animal resources of the floodplain continued to provide protein, fat, and variety to a diet that was increasingly dominated by maize. The agricultural foundation of Cahokia was maize. Maize, originally domesticated in the highlands of Mexico more than 7,000 years ago, had spread northward through Mesoamerica and into the eastern woodlands of North America over a period of several thousand years, arriving in the Mississippi Valley sometime around the 8th or 9th century of the Common Era. The adoption of maize agriculture in the central Mississippi Valley was a transformative event, comparable in its effects to the adoption of wheat agriculture in the ancient Near East or rice agriculture in East Asia. Maize is a highly productive crop that can be grown in the warm, humid summers of the Mississippi Valley with relatively simple cultivation techniques, and it produces a storable surplus that can be accumulated, redistributed, and used to support non-agricultural specialists, precisely the kind of economic foundation that earlier theorists had identified as the prerequisite for the emergence of complex society. The arrival of maize in the Mississippi Valley did not cause the emergence of Cahokia, but it created the economic conditions that made Cahokia possible, providing the agricultural surplus that could support a large, concentrated population and the social hierarchy that governed it. The importance of maize to the Cahokian economy is confirmed by multiple lines of archaeological evidence. Chemical analysis of human remains from Cahokia and from other Mississippian sites, using stable isotope ratios of carbon and nitrogen in bone collagen and bone apatite, has demonstrated that maize constituted a substantial proportion of the diet of Cahokian residents, particularly during the later phases of the city's occupation. Excavations at residential sites within and around Cahokia have produced abundant remains of charred maize cobs, kernels, and husks, indicating that maize was processed, stored, and consumed on a large scale. Specialized stone tools, particularly hoe blades made from chert, have been found in large numbers at Cahokian sites, indicating that the cultivation of maize required the production and maintenance of a substantial toolkit. The ubiquity of maize remains and maize processing tools at Cahokian sites confirms that maize agriculture was the economic foundation of the city, the primary source of the calories that fed the population and the surplus that sustained the social hierarchy. But maize alone does not explain Cahokia. The American bottom was inhabited by maize-growing peoples for at least a century before the Big Bang of 1050, and none of those earlier communities developed anything approaching the scale or the complexity of Cahokia. The emergence of Cahokia required more than maize. It required a specific combination of environmental opportunity, political leadership, religious vision, and social organization that converged at a particular moment in a particular place to produce a result that was unprecedented in the history of the region. The American bottom provided the environmental opportunity, with its fertile soils, its abundant water, and its diverse ecological niches. Maize provided the agricultural technology that could exploit those soils at the level of productivity needed to support an urban population. But the political, religious, and social dimensions of the Cahokian achievement cannot be explained by environment and agriculture alone. Something more was needed, some spark of human creativity and ambition that ignited the process and sustained it through 3 centuries of growth and elaboration. The timing of Cahokia's emergence is one of the most striking aspects of the site. Cahokia did not develop gradually from a small settlement into a large city over a period of centuries, as most cities in the ancient world did. Instead, it appears to have undergone a sudden and dramatic transformation around the year 1050 of the Common Era, a transformation that archaeologists call the Big Bang, a term borrowed from cosmology that captures the speed and the magnitude of the change. Before 1050, the site of Cahokia was a modest settlement, one of several villages in the American bottom, with a population of perhaps a few hundred people and no evidence of monumental architecture or social complexity beyond what was typical of the late woodland period in the Mississippi Valley. After 1050, Cahokia was a city, with a population of thousands, a planned urban layout centered on a massive grand plaza, a complex of monumental earthen mounds that included the largest earthen structure in the Western Hemisphere, and a material culture that was distinctly different from anything that had preceded it. The transformation was rapid, perhaps occurring within a single generation, and its causes are one of the central mysteries of Cahokian studies. The evidence for the rapidity of the transformation comes from multiple sources. Radiocarbon dating of materials from the earliest phases of monumental construction at Cahokia consistently produces dates clustering around 1050 to 1000 of the Common Era. The pottery styles associated with the earliest Cahokian occupation, which archaeologists classify as Loman phase ceramics, appear abruptly in the archaeological record, replacing the earlier late woodland pottery styles without a transitional period. The layout of the city, with its grand plaza, its aligned mounds, and its oriented grid, suggests deliberate planning rather than organic growth, a design that was conceived in advance and executed according to a predetermined plan. And the demographic evidence, based on the number and density of residential structures, suggests a rapid influx of population from surrounding areas, as though people were being drawn to Cahokia from across the region by some powerful attraction, whether economic, political, or religious. The Grand Plaza of Cahokia was the heart of the city, an open area of approximately 19 hectares that served as the central gathering place for the community. The plaza was not a natural feature of the landscape. It was an engineered surface, leveled and graded by the removal of natural rises and the filling of natural depressions, creating a flat, even expanse that was remarkably uniform in its surface elevation. The engineering required to create such a surface was considerable, involving the movement of thousands of cubic meters of earth and the careful grading of the resulting surface to ensure proper drainage. The Grand Plaza was oriented on a north-south axis, with Monk's Mound at its northern end, and it was flanked on its east and west sides by rows of smaller mounds that created a formal, symmetrical arrangement suggesting a sophisticated understanding of urban design and a deliberate effort to create a monumental civic space that would impress and overawe the people who entered it. The plaza was large enough to accommodate the entire population of the city, and it was probably used for the public ceremonies, the feasts, the games, and the political assemblies that brought the community together and reinforced its collective identity. The game of chunky, a rolling stone game that was one of the most popular pastimes in the Mississippian world, may have been played on the Grand Plaza along with other communal activities that served to bind the diverse population of the city into a single, functioning community. Monk's Mound, the centerpiece of the Cahokian landscape, is an achievement of engineering that deserves detailed examination. The mound was constructed in at least 14 distinct stages over a period of roughly 3 centuries, from approximately 900 to 1200 of the Common Era. Each stage involved the addition of a new layer of earth to the existing structure, enlarging its footprint, increasing its height, and adding new terraces and platforms to its surface. The final form of the mound consisted of 4 terraces, the largest at the base and progressively smaller ones ascending to the summit, where a large wooden building, probably the residence of the paramount chief or the site of important ceremonial activities, once stood. The mound measures approximately 290 meters long, 240 meters wide, and 30 meters high, dimensions that make it one of the largest structures of any kind in the pre-Columbian Americas. The volume of earth contained in Monk's Mound, more than 600,000 cubic meters, exceeds the volume of many of the smaller Egyptian pyramids, and its construction, entirely by hand, without wheeled vehicles, draft animals, or metal tools, represents one of the most impressive feats of human labor mobilization in the ancient world. To grasp the scale of this achievement, consider what the construction of Monk's Mound required in practical terms. Every cubic meter of earth in the mound was dug from borrow pits in the surrounding floodplain, loaded into woven baskets that could hold roughly 30 to 50 kilograms of soil each, carried to the construction site on the backs of human workers, and deposited in the precise location specified by the construction supervisors. At an estimated volume of 622,000 cubic meters, and assuming each basket carried roughly 1/30th of a cubic meter of soil, the construction of Monk's Mound required the transport of roughly 18 million individual basket loads. If a single worker could carry 10 loads per day, the construction would have required roughly 1.8 million person-days of labor spread across the 3 centuries of the mound's construction. This calculation is approximate, but the order of magnitude is not in dispute. The construction of Monk's Mound was a project of enormous scale, requiring the sustained, organized labor of hundreds of workers over many generations. The organizational capacity required to coordinate this labor, to feed and house the workers, to source and transport the materials, and to maintain the continuity of the project across centuries, implies a level of social complexity and political authority that is comparable to that required for monumental construction projects anywhere in the ancient world. The construction of Monk's Mound involved a level of engineering sophistication that was not fully appreciated until modern geotechnical investigations were conducted at the site. Core samples taken from the mound in the 1960s and 70s revealed that the mound was not simply a pile of dirt. It was a carefully engineered structure, built with alternating layers of different types of soil, sand, clay, and silt, selected and placed in sequences designed to ensure structural stability and to manage the drainage of water through the mound's interior. The builders of Monk's Mound understood, at an empirical level, the principles of soil mechanics, the behavior of different types of soil under load, their permeability to water, and their susceptibility to erosion and slumping. They use this understanding to construct a mound that has remained structurally sound for more than 1,000 years, despite the challenges of the Mississippi Valley climate, with its heavy rains, its seasonal flooding, and its freeze-thaw cycles that can be devastating to earthen structures. Modern geotechnical engineers who have studied the mound have expressed admiration for the sophistication of the construction techniques, noting that the selection and placement of different soil types within the mound demonstrates an understanding of soil behavior that is consistent with modern engineering principles, even though the Cahokians presumably arrived at this understanding through empirical observation and trial and error rather than through theoretical analysis. The mounds at Cahokia were not all the same shape or size. Archaeologists have identified several distinct types, each presumably serving a different function. The largest mounds, including Monk's Mound, were flat-topped platform mounds that served as elevated platforms for important buildings, temples, chiefs' residences, or council houses that were visible from across the plaza, and that symbolized the elevated status of the individuals and the activities associated with them. Smaller conical mounds appear to have served as burial mounds, containing the remains of important individuals along with their grave goods. Ridgetop mounds, elongated earthen ridges, may have served as boundaries or as markers for important sightlines. The variety of mound types at Cahokia suggests a complex ceremonial and social landscape in which different spaces served different purposes and different audiences, a landscape that was deliberately designed to organize and to express the social and religious values of the community that created it. The population of Cahokia at its peak has been the subject of ongoing scholarly debate. Early estimates, based on the number and density of residential structures visible in the archaeological record, place the population at 10,000 to 15,000. More recent estimates, based on more extensive survey data and more sophisticated methods of population estimation, have suggested figures as high as 20,000 or even 30,000, though the higher figures remain controversial. Even the most conservative estimates place Cahokia's population in the range of 10,000, which would make it the largest settlement in North America north of Mexico by a wide margin. The next largest settlements in the eastern woodlands during the same period had populations of perhaps 1,000 to 2,000, making Cahokia 5 to 10 times larger than any of its contemporaries. This disparity in size is itself significant, because it suggests that Cahokia was not simply the largest of a series of comparable settlements, but something qualitatively different, a true urban centre in a region where no comparable urban centre had previously existed. The residential areas that surrounded the monumental core of Cahokia provide important evidence about the social structure and the daily life of the city's inhabitants. Excavations have revealed dense clusters of small, rectangular houses, built of wooden posts and covered with thatch or woven mats, arranged in neighborhoods that appear to have been organized along lines of kinship or occupation. Some houses were larger and better built than others, suggesting differences in social status or economic resources. Some neighborhoods were located closer to the ceremonial center than others, suggesting that proximity to the center conferred prestige or reflected social rank. The residential archaeology of Cahokia is still in its early stages, and much remains to be learned about the daily lives of the people who inhabited the city, their domestic routines, their family structures, their occupational specializations, and their relationships with the elite who controlled the ceremonial center and the construction of the mounds. To appreciate the scale of Cahokia's achievement, consider some comparisons that bring the numbers into perspective. At the time of Cahokia's peak, around 1000 to 1200 of the Common Era, the City of London had a population of perhaps 15,000 to 20,000. Paris was larger, with perhaps 20,000 to 30,000, but not dramatically so. The great cities of the Islamic world, Baghdad and Cairo and Cordoba, were much larger, with populations in the hundreds of thousands. But among the cities of medieval Europe, Cahokia would have been a city of respectable size, comparable to many of the regional capitals and trading centres of the period. The fact that a city of this size existed in the heart of North America, built by indigenous peoples using only the materials and technologies available to them, without any influence from or contact with the urban civilizations of Europe or Asia, is a testament to the capacity of human societies to develop complex urban forms independently under a wide range of environmental and cultural conditions. The trade network that connected Cahokia to communities across the North American continent was another expression of the city's reach and influence. Archaeological excavations at Cahokia and at sites throughout the Mississippi Valley and beyond have revealed a pattern of long-distance exchange that is impressive in both its geographic extent and its volume. Copper, probably originating from the native copper deposits of the Lake Superior region, more than 1,000 kilometers to the north, was used to make ornamental objects, including distinctive ear spools, pendants, and sheet copper headdress plates that have been found at Cahokia and at Cahokia-influenced sites across the southeast and the Midwest. Marine shell, particularly whelk shell from the Gulf Coast, more than 1,000 kilometers to the south, was used to make beads, pendants, and engraved gorgets, ornamental shell discs worn on the chest, that bear designs associated with a shared iconographic system known as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. Mica, a translucent mineral prized for its decorative properties, was obtained from deposits in the southern Appalachian Mountains, hundreds of kilometers to the east. Burlington chert, a high-quality flint used for the production of finely crafted bifaces, hoe blades, and ceremonial objects, was quarried from deposits in southern Illinois and traded throughout the region. The diversity and the geographic range of these trade goods demonstrate that Cahokia was not an isolated settlement, but the hub of a vast network of exchange and interaction that connected communities across nearly half a continent. The Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, the shared iconographic system that linked Cahokia to communities across the eastern woodlands, deserves particular attention because it reveals the depth of Cahokia's cultural influence. The complex consisted of a set of recurring motifs, including the forked eye, the bi-lobed arrow, the hand and eye, the rattlesnake, the falcon warrior, and the chunky player, that appeared on objects made from shell, copper, pottery, and stone at sites throughout the Mississippian world. These motifs were not merely decorative. They were symbolic, encoding information about cosmology, social identity, political authority, and spiritual power that was shared across a wide geographic area. The distribution of these motifs, from the Gulf Coast to the Great Lakes, from the plains to the Atlantic seaboard, demonstrates that Cahokia was the center of a cultural system that extended far beyond the immediate vicinity of the city, a system that transmitted ideas, beliefs, and practices across thousands of kilometers, and that shaped the development of complex society throughout the eastern woodlands. The engraved shell gorgets of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex are among the most artistically accomplished artifacts of pre-Columbian North America. These circular shell discs, typically carved from the columella of large marine whelk shells obtained from the Gulf of Mexico, were engraved with intricate designs depicting warriors, supernatural beings, cosmic symbols, and narrative scenes that appear to illustrate mythological episodes or ceremonial events. The craftsmanship of the finest gorgets is extraordinary, with fine-line engraving that rivals the best work of any ancient civilization. The iconography of the gorgets reveals a complex cosmological system in which the world was conceived as a layered universe, with an upper world of celestial beings, a middle world of human existence, and a lower world of powerful and dangerous underwater spirits. The falcon warrior, a recurring figure in the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex imagery, appears to represent a supernatural being or a deified ruler who mediates between these cosmic realms, bridging the worlds of the living and the dead, the human and the divine. The game of chunky, mentioned frequently in the iconography of the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex and widely played throughout the Mississippian world, provides another window into Cahokian culture and social organization. Chunky was a competitive game in which players rolled a stone disc along a smooth, prepared surface and then threw spears or poles in an attempt to land closest to the point where the disc came to rest. The game was played with specially crafted stone discs, called chunky stones, that were ground and polished to a high degree of precision, and that are among the most common artifacts found at Cahokian and Mississippian sites. Ethnographic accounts from the contact period describe chunky as a game of intense competition and high stakes, with participants wagering their possessions, their status, and even their lives on the outcome. The prevalence of chunky stones and chunky-related imagery at Cahokia and at sites throughout the Mississippian world suggests that the game played an important role in the social and political life of these communities, serving as a venue for competition, display, and the negotiation of status and alliance. The sheer density of settlement in the American bottom during the Cahokian period is another measure of the extraordinary nature of this community. Archaeological surveys of the American bottom have documented more than 200 settlement sites dating to the Mississippian period, ranging from isolated farmsteads with a single house to substantial villages with platform mounds and plazas. The total population of the American bottom during the Cahokian period has been estimated at 30,000 to 50,000, when the populations of both Cahokia itself and the surrounding satellite communities are included. This population density was unprecedented in the eastern woodlands and may have been among the highest in the pre-Columbian Americas outside of Mesoamerica and the Andes. The concentration of so many people in a relatively small area created both opportunities and challenges. Opportunities for economic specialization, cultural elaboration, and political centralization, and challenges related to food production, sanitation, resource management, and social control. The population concentration at Cahokia also had implications for the surrounding region. Archaeological surveys of the broader American bottom have revealed a pattern of satellite settlements, organized around the central site of Cahokia, smaller communities that appear to have been economically and politically linked to the main city. Some of these satellite communities had their own small mounds and plazas, suggesting that they served as secondary ceremonial centers for the surrounding rural population. Others were purely residential, clusters of farmsteads that produced the maize and other agricultural products that fed the urban population. The relationship between Cahokia and its satellite communities is a subject of ongoing scholarly investigation, but the emerging picture is of a regional settlement system in which Cahokia served as the political, ceremonial, and economic center, with a network of subsidiary communities arrayed around it in a hierarchical pattern that reflected and reinforced the political authority of the Cahokian elite. The transformation of the American bottom landscape by the Cahokian settlement was profound and far-reaching. Thousands of hectares of forest were cleared for agriculture and construction. The courses of streams were altered by the construction of canals and drainage ditches. The topography of the floodplain was modified by the construction of mounds, plazas, causeways, and borrow pits. The vegetation of the region was changed by the introduction of maize cultivation on a scale that transformed entire ecosystems. The Cahokians did not merely inhabit the American bottom. They transformed it, reshaping the landscape to suit their needs and leaving behind a terrain that bore the marks of their activity for centuries after their departure. The environmental transformation of the American bottom by the Cahokian settlement is one of the earliest and most dramatic examples of large-scale landscape modification by a non-industrial society in North America, and it provides evidence of a level of environmental impact that belies the common assumption that pre-Columbian indigenous peoples lived in harmony with nature, leaving no trace on the landscape. Then something happened that changed everything. The core problem of Cahokian studies is not what Cahokia was. The archaeological evidence is abundant, well-preserved, and richly informative, providing a detailed picture of a complex urban society with monumental architecture, long-distance trade networks, social stratification, and a rich ceremonial life. The core problem is twofold. First, why did Cahokia emerge so suddenly, transforming in what appears to have been a single generation from a modest village into the largest city in North America? And second, why did it collapse so completely, declining from a major urban center to an abandoned ruin within roughly 2 centuries, leaving behind no written record, no oral tradition that survived to the contact period, and no successor state that preserved the memory of its existence? The suddenness of Cahokia's emergence is one of its most puzzling features. The archaeological record shows a clear discontinuity around the year 1050 of the Common Era, a break in the material culture, the settlement pattern, and the social organization of the American bottom that is so sharp and so dramatic that it has been compared, only partly in jest, to the sudden appearance of a fully formed civilization out of thin air. Before 1050, the American bottom was inhabited by people of the late woodland and early Mississippian traditions, living in small, dispersed villages, practicing a mixed economy of hunting, gathering, and small-scale agriculture, and organized at a relatively simple level of social complexity. After 1050, the same landscape was dominated by a single massive, centrally planned settlement with monumental earthworks, a grand plaza, a wooden palisade, and evidence of a ruling elite that exercised authority over a population of thousands. The transition from one to the other was not gradual. It was abrupt, and the abruptness has forced archaeologists to search for the specific event or events that triggered the transformation. Several theories have been proposed. One of the most influential, advanced by the archaeologist Timothy Pauktat of the University of Illinois, argues that Cahokia's emergence was the result of a deliberate act of political and religious innovation, the founding of a new kind of community organized around a new set of religious beliefs and ceremonial practices that attracted settlers from across the region and that provided the ideological foundation for the new social order. According to this theory, the founding of Cahokia was not a gradual process of population growth and institutional development, but a revolutionary event, a conscious decision by a charismatic leader or a group of leaders to create something new, something unprecedented, something that had no precedent in the existing cultural landscape of the Mississippi Valley. The theory draws support from the archaeological evidence, which shows that the early phases of Cahokia's monumental construction were remarkably rapid and remarkably coordinated, suggesting a level of planning and intentionality that is difficult to explain as the product of incremental, unplanned growth. The alternative theory, favored by other scholars, emphasizes ecological and economic factors. According to this view, the emergence of Cahokia was driven by the adoption of a new, highly productive variety of maize, known as Eastern Eight-Row or Northern Flint, that was better adapted to the climate of the central Mississippi Valley than the earlier varieties, and that made possible a dramatic increase in agricultural productivity. The increased productivity, combined with the exceptional fertility of the American bottom soils and the abundant wild resources of the floodplain environment, created the economic surplus that supported the rapid growth of the Cahokian population and the construction of the monumental earthworks. In this view, Cahokia's emergence was not a revolutionary event, but an economic one, the result of a technological innovation, the new maize variety, that unlocked the latent productivity of the American bottom environment and set in motion a process of population growth, social stratification, and political centralization that culminated in the urban center that we call Cahokia. Both theories have merit, and neither has been definitively proven or disproven. The truth, as is often the case in archaeology, may lie in a combination of factors, an interaction between economic conditions, political leadership, religious innovation, and environmental opportunity that converged at a particular place and time to produce a result that no single factor could have produced alone. The archaeological evidence from the earliest phases of Cahokia's urban development is consistent with both explanations and with a synthesis of them. The rapid adoption of a new, more productive maize variety could have created the economic surplus that made urbanization possible, while a charismatic leader or a new religious movement could have provided the organizational impetus that channeled that surplus into the construction of a planned urban center. The result would have been a city that was both economically enabled and ideologically driven, a settlement that grew not merely because it could, because the economic conditions favored growth, but because it was designed to grow, because its founders had a vision of what it should become and the organizational capacity to realize that vision. The evidence for the ideological dimension of Cahokia's founding is particularly compelling. The material culture of the earliest Cahokian phases shows a deliberate break with the past, a rejection of the pottery styles, the house forms, and the settlement patterns of the preceding period, replaced by new styles, new forms, and new spatial arrangements that appear to have been introduced as a package, as though the founders of Cahokia were consciously creating a new cultural identity for a new community. The orientation of the city's layout to the cardinal directions, the alignment of Woodhenge with the equinoctial and solstitial sunrise positions, and the placement of the major mounds in a symmetrical arrangement around the Grand Plaza, all suggest a cosmological program, a deliberate effort to make the city a physical model of the cosmos, as the Cahokians understood it. The city was not just a place to live. It was a sacred landscape, a built environment that embodied the cosmological beliefs and the political values of its creators, and that communicated those beliefs and values to everyone who entered it. The role of a possible supernova in the founding of Cahokia has been a subject of speculative but intriguing scholarly discussion. In the year 1054 of the Common Era, a supernova appeared in the constellation Taurus, an explosion of a dying star so bright that it was visible in daylight for more than 3 weeks and visible at night for nearly 2 years. The supernova was recorded by Chinese and Japanese astronomers and may have been observed by the peoples of North America as well, though no direct evidence of such observations has been found. Some scholars have speculated that the appearance of the supernova, a dramatic and unprecedented celestial event, may have been interpreted by the peoples of the central Mississippi Valley as a sign from the gods, a cosmic event of profound spiritual significance that inspired or catalyzed the founding of Cahokia. The timing is suggestive. The supernova appeared in 1054, and the Big Bang at Cahokia is dated to approximately 1050. But the correlation may be coincidental, and the hypothesis remains speculative in the absence of direct evidence linking the two events. And it gets worse. The evidence from Mound 72, a relatively small mound located to the south of the Grand Plaza, has revealed a dimension of Cahokian society that is deeply disturbing and that has generated intense scholarly debate. Excavations at Mound 72 in the 1960s and 70s, led by the archaeologist Melvin Fowler, uncovered a series of extraordinary burials that provided dramatic evidence of both the wealth and the violence of Cahokian society. The central burial in the mound was that of a man in his 40s, laid out on a bed of more than 20,000 marine shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird, probably a falcon or a thunderbird, a figure of enormous symbolic significance in the iconography of the Mississippian world. The man was accompanied by a cache of grave goods that included more than 800 arrowheads of various types, sheets of mica, and bundles of other prestige items. Surrounding this central burial were additional burials, including mass graves containing the remains of more than 270 individuals, many of whom showed no signs of status or wealth, and some of whom showed clear evidence of having been sacrificed. The sacrificial burials at Mound 72 are among the most dramatic evidence of human sacrifice in the pre-Columbian archaeology of North America. One mass grave contained the remains of 53 young women, aged approximately 15 to 25, who appeared to have been killed at the same time and buried together. Another contained the remains of 39 men and women who had been clubbed to death, their bodies thrown into a pit with no accompanying grave goods. Still another contained 4 men whose hands and heads had been removed, their decapitated and mutilated bodies arranged in a line. The juxtaposition of these mass sacrificial burials with the elaborate, wealth-laden burial of the central figure in the mound paints a picture of a society in which enormous disparities of power and status existed. A society in which some individuals possessed the authority to command the deaths of others, and in which human sacrifice served as an expression and a reinforcement of that authority. Recent research has complicated the picture further. Isotopic analysis of the skeletal remains from Mound 72 has revealed that many of the individuals buried in the mass graves were not local to the American bottom. Their dietary isotope signatures suggest that they came from regions outside the immediate Cahokian area, possibly from communities that were subject to Cahokia's political authority, or that supplied tribute, including human beings, to the Cahokian elite. If this interpretation is correct, then the sacrificial victims at Mound 72 may have been captives or tribute offerings from subordinate communities, individuals whose deaths served to demonstrate the power and the reach of the Cahokian paramount, and to reinforce the political hierarchy that connected Cahokia to its satellite communities across the region. The violence documented at Mound 72 was not random. It was systematic, organized, and politically motivated, a tool of statecraft rather than an expression of individual aggression. The evidence from Mound 72 has forced scholars to confront the darker aspects of Cahokian civilization, the violence, the coercion, and the inequality that coexisted with the monumental architecture, the long-distance trade, and the astronomical knowledge for which Cahokia is celebrated. The temptation to idealize ancient civilizations, to imagine them as utopian communities free from the violence and the injustice that characterize modern societies, is powerful and understandable. But the evidence from Cahokia does not support idealization. It supports a more nuanced and more troubling picture, a picture of a society that was capable of extraordinary achievements and extraordinary cruelty, a society in which the construction of monumental architecture and the sacrifice of human beings were not contradictions but complementary expressions of the same system of power and belief. The astronomical knowledge of the Cahokians is documented by one of the most intriguing features of the site, the series of wooden post circles that archaeologists have named Woodhenge, by analogy with the famous stone circle at Stonehenge in England. Excavations in the 1960s and 70s revealed the post holes of several large circles of evenly spaced wooden posts, the largest of which had a diameter of approximately 130 meters and contained 48 posts. The posts were arranged so that when viewed from a central observation point, certain posts aligned with the positions of the sunrise on the equinoxes and the solstices, the astronomical events that mark the turning points of the solar year. The alignment was precise, and it demonstrated that the Cahokians possessed a sophisticated understanding of the movements of the sun across the horizon, an understanding that they embedded in the architectural fabric of their city, and that they presumably used to regulate the ceremonial calendar that governed the rhythm of civic and religious life. The construction of Woodhenge was not a one-time event. The archaeological evidence indicates that the post circles were rebuilt at least 5 times, each time with a slightly different configuration, suggesting that the Cahokians refined their astronomical observations over time, correcting errors and improving the accuracy of their alignments. The commitment of resources to the construction and maintenance of Woodhenge over a period of many decades indicates that astronomical observation was not a casual interest but a central preoccupation of the Cahokian elite, a body of specialized knowledge that was cultivated, refined, and deployed for purposes that were simultaneously practical and symbolic. The Woodhenge alignments are significant not only for what they reveal about Cahokian astronomical knowledge, but for what they imply about Cahokian social organization. The construction and maintenance of a solar observation facility of this kind requires a community that values astronomical knowledge, that supports the specialists who possess it, and that organizes its communal life around the ceremonial cycle that the astronomical observations define. The Cahokians did not build Woodhenge as an academic exercise. They built it because it served a practical and a ceremonial function, marking the dates of important festivals, coordinating the agricultural calendar, and reinforcing the authority of the leaders who controlled the ceremonial cycle. Woodhenge was not merely an observatory. It was a political instrument, a tool for the legitimation of authority, a physical embodiment of the knowledge and the power that the ruling elite claimed as their exclusive prerogative. The palisade that surrounded the central precinct of Cahokia is another feature that raises important questions about the nature of Cahokian society. The palisade was a massive wooden wall, constructed from thousands of logs set vertically in a trench and plastered with clay to create a solid, imposing barrier. The wall enclosed an area of approximately 120 hectares, including the Grand Plaza, Monk's Mound, and several other major mounds, separating the ceremonial and administrative center of the city from the surrounding residential areas. The palisade was rebuilt at least 4 times during the city's history, each time requiring the felling, transport, and emplacement of thousands of trees, a labor investment that was comparable in scale to the construction of the mounds themselves. Archaeological investigations have estimated that each construction phase of the palisade required approximately 15,000 to 20,000 logs, each of which had to be felled with stone axes, transported to the construction site, and set upright in a prepared trench. The total labor investment in the construction and maintenance of the palisade across all 4 phases was enormous, rivaling the labor invested in the construction of Monk's Mound itself. The existence of the palisade raises the question of what the Cahokians were defending against. Was the palisade a defensive structure built to protect the city against external attack, or was it a social barrier designed to separate the sacred precinct of the elite from the profane world of the commoners, to control access to the ceremonial center, and to reinforce the social distinctions between those who were allowed inside and those who were not? The scholarly consensus has shifted over time. Earlier interpretations favored the defensive hypothesis, arguing that the palisade was built in response to increasing conflict with neighboring communities or with hostile groups from outside the region. More recent interpretations have emphasized the social and ceremonial functions of the palisade, noting that the wall served to define the boundary of the sacred precinct and to regulate access to the spaces within it, functions that are consistent with the general pattern of spatial control and social differentiation that characterizes the Cahokian site as a whole. The truth may include elements of both interpretations. A wall that served simultaneously as a defense against external threats and as a boundary between the sacred and the profane, between the elite and the commoners, between those who controlled the ceremonial life of the city and those who did not. The construction of the palisade also raises questions about the environmental impact of the Cahokian settlement. Each construction phase of the palisade required an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 logs, which means that over the course of 4 rebuilding episodes, the palisade alone consumed between 60,000 and 80,000 trees. The trees had to be felled with stone axes, trimmed, transported to the construction site, and set into prepared trenches, a process that required an enormous investment of labor and that imposed a significant demand on the forest resources of the American bottom. The deforestation caused by the construction of the palisade, combined with the clearing of land for agriculture and the harvesting of timber for domestic construction and firewood, would have progressively stripped the forests from the immediate vicinity of the city, creating a deforested zone that expanded outward over time as the nearest trees were felled and workers had to travel increasingly far to find suitable timber. The environmental consequences of this deforestation, including increased erosion, changes in local hydrology, and the loss of habitat for game animals, may have contributed to the environmental degradation that some scholars believe was a factor in Cahokia's eventual decline. The relationship between the palisade and the practice of human sacrifice raises another disturbing possibility. If the palisade was designed to separate the sacred precinct from the surrounding community, and if the rituals performed within the sacred precinct included human sacrifice, then the wall may have served, in part, to conceal the most violent and disturbing aspects of the ceremonial life from the general population, or, alternatively, to dramatize them, creating a spectacle of exclusion and mystery that enhanced the power and the prestige of the elite who controlled the ceremonial center. The architecture of the Blay Palisade, with its bastions and its restricted entry points, suggests a space that was designed for controlled access, a space in which entry was a privilege and exclusion was the norm, a space in which the distinction between inside and outside was charged with social and spiritual significance. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. The decline of Cahokia was as dramatic as its rise. By the year 1200, the population of the city had begun to decrease. By 1300, the site was largely or entirely abandoned. The mounds remained, silent and overgrown, but the people were gone, dispersed to other locations across the Mississippi Valley and beyond, their city left behind as an empty monument to a way of life that had been sustained for 3 centuries, and then abandoned for reasons that the archaeological evidence has not yet fully explained. The decline and abandonment of Cahokia has been the subject of intense scholarly investigation for more than half a century, and the theories that have been proposed to explain it illustrate both the power and the limitations of archaeological reasoning when applied to questions of historical causation. Each theory captures a part of the truth, none captures all of it, and the interplay between them reveals the complexity of the forces that can bring a civilization to its end. The first and most widely discussed theory links Cahokia's decline to environmental degradation. According to this theory, the rapid growth of the Cahokian population and the intensive agricultural practices that sustained it placed unsustainable demands on the environment of the American bottom, leading to a cascade of ecological problems that eventually undermined the economic foundation of the city. The clearing of forests for construction timber, for firewood, and for agricultural land would have accelerated soil erosion, increased the frequency and severity of flooding, and reduced the availability of game animals and other wild resources. The intensive cultivation of maize on the same soils for generation after generation would have depleted the soil of essential nutrients, reducing crop yields and increasing the vulnerability of the agricultural system to drought, flood, and other environmental stresses. The construction of the palisade alone, which was rebuilt at least 4 times, would have required the felling of more than 20,000 trees, a massive deforestation event that would have had significant consequences for the local ecology, reducing habitat for game, increasing runoff, and contributing to the sedimentation of the streams and wetlands on which the Cahokians depended for fish and waterfowl. The math is striking when we calculate the resource demands of the Cahokian population. If 10,000 to 20,000 people were living in the American bottom at Cahokia's peak, and each person required a minimum of roughly 1,500 to 2,000 kilocalories per day from maize, the total annual maize requirement would have been staggering, demanding the cultivation of hundreds of hectares of fertile floodplain soil. The requirement for firewood, used for cooking, heating, and the firing of pottery, would have been equally enormous. The requirement for construction timber, for the palisade, for the buildings that topped the mounds, and for the thousands of residential structures that housed the population would have placed additional demands on the already stressed forest resources. The cumulative effect of these demands, sustained over a period of 2 or 3 centuries, may have been sufficient to degrade the environment to the point where it could no longer support the population that depended on it. But here is the problem with the environmental degradation theory. The American bottom is one of the most productive and most resilient agricultural environments in North America. The floodplain soils are renewed by periodic flooding, which deposits new layers of nutrient-rich sediment on the surface. The climate is warm and humid, with adequate rainfall for maize agriculture in most years. The wild resources of the floodplain, the fish, the waterfowl, the deer, the nuts and berries, are abundant and diverse. The environment of the American bottom is not a fragile ecosystem that can be easily destroyed by human activity. It is a robust, self-renewing system that has supported agriculture and human habitation for thousands of years, before and after the Cahokian period. If the environment of the American bottom was as degraded as the environmental theory suggests, one would expect to see evidence of that degradation in the geological and paleoecological record. And while some evidence exists, including evidence of increased erosion and sedimentation, the evidence is not as dramatic or as clearly linked to the period of Cahokia's decline as the theory requires. A related dimension of the environmental theory concerns the problem of pollution and waste management. A city of 10,000 to 20,000 people generates an enormous volume of organic waste, including human sewage, food scraps, animal carcasses, and the byproducts of craft production. In modern cities, this waste is managed through systems of sewage, solid waste collection, and water treatment that prevent the accumulation of disease-causing pathogens and the contamination of water supplies. In ancient cities, waste management was a persistent challenge, and the failure to manage waste effectively could have devastating consequences for public health. At Cahokia, the evidence suggests that waste management was at best rudimentary. Excavations of residential areas have revealed dense accumulations of organic debris, including animal bones, broken pottery, and other refuse that were deposited in shallow pits and on the ground surface around the houses. The shallow groundwater of the American bottom floodplain would have been easily contaminated by this surface waste, creating conditions that were favorable for the spread of waterborne diseases. Epidemiological analysis of skeletal remains from Cahokian cemeteries has revealed elevated rates of infectious disease, nutritional deficiency, and anemia, conditions that are consistent with the kind of chronic health stress that one would expect in a large, densely settled community with inadequate sanitation. The health consequences of urban living may have been one of the factors that contributed to Cahokia's decline. If the disease burden of the Cahokian population increased over time, as the archaeological evidence suggests, then the quality of life in the city would have declined correspondingly, providing an incentive for people to leave and reducing the city's attractiveness to potential immigrants from surrounding regions. The combination of declining agricultural productivity, increasing disease burden, growing social tension, and the progressive deforestation of the surrounding landscape may have created a syndrome of urban decline that was self-reinforcing, each factor exacerbating the others in a feedback loop that gradually but inexorably undermined the viability of the city as a place to live. A second theory focuses on climate change. Paleoclimatic studies of the central Mississippi Valley have identified a period of prolonged drought in the 13th century, coinciding with the period of Cahokia's decline. The drought has been linked to a broader climatic phenomenon known as the medieval climate anomaly, a period of generally warmer and drier conditions that affected much of North America and other parts of the world during the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries. Tree ring records from the region show a series of severe droughts in the 1200s, droughts that would have reduced maize yields, depleted water supplies, and put enormous pressure on a population that was already stretched to the limits of its food production capacity. The drought hypothesis is supported by evidence from other Mississippian sites in the region, many of which show signs of decline and abandonment during the same period, suggesting a regional environmental crisis rather than a purely local phenomenon. Recent paleoclimatic research has added nuance to the drought hypothesis. Studies of sediment cores from lakes in the central Mississippi Valley have revealed that the climatic history of the region during the Cahokian period was more complex than a simple story of drought suggests. The period of Cahokia's most rapid growth, from 1050 to 1100, coincided with a period of unusually favourable climate, with warm temperatures, adequate rainfall, and long growing seasons that would have boosted maize productivity and supported population growth. The shift to drier conditions in the 1200s, when it came, represented not just a drought but a reversal of the favourable conditions that had supported Cahokia's growth, a return to the kind of climate variability that had characterized the region before the Cahokian period. The implication is that Cahokia's growth was enabled by a climatic window of opportunity that subsequently closed, leaving the city's population exposed to environmental conditions that the system had not been designed to withstand. The climate change theory is compelling, but it too has limitations. Drought is a recurring feature of the Mississippi Valley climate, and the peoples of the region had experienced and survived droughts before. The question is why the droughts of the 13th century proved fatal to the Cahokian system when earlier droughts had not. The answer may lie not in the severity of the droughts themselves, but in the vulnerability of the system to drought. A vulnerability that had increased over time as the population grew. The forests were cleared, the soils were depleted, and the social and political structures that held the community together came under increasing strain. The droughts of the 1300s may not have caused the collapse of Cahokia. They may have been the final stress on a system that was already weakened by a century of environmental degradation, social tension, and political instability. A third theory emphasizes internal social and political factors. According to this view, the decline of Cahokia was driven not by environmental crisis, but by the breakdown of the social and political systems that had held the community together. The evidence from Mound 72 and from other contexts at Cahokia suggests a society in which power was concentrated in the hands of a small elite, an elite that maintained its authority through a combination of religious prestige, control of trade networks, and the threat or use of violence, including human sacrifice. This kind of centralized, coercive authority is inherently unstable because it depends on the continued acquiescence of a population that has little reason to accept the authority of its rulers other than fear and religious belief. If the rulers' claims to supernatural authority were undermined, if the trade networks that provided the elite with their prestige goods were disrupted, if the agricultural surplus that funded the elite's lifestyle and the monumental construction projects that symbolized their power declined, then the entire social system could unravel, with the population dispersing to other locations where life was less constrained and less dangerous. The concept of fissioning provides a useful framework for understanding the dispersal of the Cahokian population. In many pre-state societies, when a community becomes too large, too conflicted, or too oppressive, segments of the population simply leave, breaking away from the parent community to establish new settlements in less crowded or less constrained locations. This process of fissioning is a common response to the tensions that arise in large, concentrated communities, and it has been documented in ethnographic studies of societies around the world. The decline of Cahokia may have involved a similar process, with segments of the population leaving the city in response to environmental stress, political oppression, or social conflict, and establishing new communities in the surrounding countryside, carrying with them the cultural traditions and social practices that they had learned at Cahokia, but organizing themselves in smaller, less centralized, less hierarchical forms. The process would have been gradual, spread across decades or centuries, and it would have left no dramatic archaeological signature, no destruction layer, no mass burial, no evidence of sudden catastrophe. It would have looked, in the archaeological record, exactly like what the evidence shows: a slow progressive decline in population, in monumental construction, and in the material markers of social complexity. There is evidence that social tensions at Cahokia may have increased during the later phases of the city's occupation. The palisade, which was rebuilt multiple times, suggests an increasing concern with defense or with the control of access to the central precinct. Some residential areas show evidence of burning, which may indicate domestic violence or the destruction of houses as an act of social protest. The evidence of human sacrifice, which is concentrated in the earlier phases of the site, may indicate a period of coercive control that later provoked resistance and rebellion. The decline in monumental construction activity during the 12th and 13th centuries may reflect a decline in the authority of the ruling elite and in their capacity to mobilize the labor force needed for large-scale construction projects. And the evidence of increasing dietary stress in the later phases, including skeletal indicators of malnutrition and disease, suggests that the quality of life for ordinary Cahokians may have declined during the later phases of the city's occupation, providing an additional incentive for people to leave. A fourth theory, which has gained increasing attention in recent years, focuses on political fragmentation and the dispersal of population to competing centers. According to this view, Cahokia did not collapse, it decentralized. The political and religious authority that had been concentrated at Cahokia during the city's peak was gradually diffused to other communities in the region, as local leaders established their own ceremonial centers, built their own mounds, and attracted their own followers. The result was a fragmentation of the Cahokian system into smaller, more dispersed communities, each with its own leadership, its own ceremonial life, and its own identity, none of which was powerful enough to sustain the level of population concentration and monumental construction that had characterized the Cahokian peak. In this view, the people of Cahokia did not die. They moved. They dispersed to other locations across the Mississippi Valley and beyond, carrying with them the cultural traditions, the religious beliefs, and the social practices that they had developed at Cahokia, and adapting them to new environments and new circumstances. The descendants of the Cahokians may be the ancestors of many of the indigenous peoples who were living in the Mississippi Valley and the Southeast when the first European explorers arrived in the 16th and 17th centuries. The discovery of Cahokia's significance by modern scholarship is itself a story worth telling. The mounds over the American bottom had been known to European settlers since the 18th century, and they had been the subject of speculation and investigations since at least the early 19th century. Early visitors to the site were impressed by the size and the regularity of the mounds, but they lacked the methods and the conceptual framework to understand what they were seeing. Some attributed the mounds to natural geological processes, mistaking them for glacial features or erosion remnants. Others recognized them as human constructions, but attributed them to the mythical mound builders, the lost race of superior beings that popular culture had invented to explain the existence of the mounds without crediting the indigenous peoples of the region. The first systematic archaeological investigation of the Cahokia site was conducted in the 1920s and 30s by the archaeologist Warren K. Moorhead, who recognized the scale and significance of the site, but lacked the methods and the resources to investigate it fully. Moorhead's surveys documented the number and the arrangement of the mounds, and produced the first systematic map of the site, establishing the baseline of archaeological knowledge on which all subsequent research has been built. But Moorhead's work was limited by the primitive state of archaeological methodology in the early 20th century, and many of his observations were superseded by later, more rigorous investigations. Subsequent investigations in the 1950s and 60s, including the excavations at Mound 72, led by Melvin Fowler, began to reveal the true complexity and the darker dimensions of Cahokian society. Fowler's excavations were among the most dramatic in the history of North American archaeology, producing evidence of human sacrifice, elite burials of staggering richness, and mass graves that challenged the prevailing assumptions about the nature of pre-Columbian societies in eastern North America. Fowler's findings were widely published and discussed, and they played a crucial role in establishing Cahokia as one of the most important archaeological sites in the Americas. But it was not until the 1970s and 80s, with the development of new archaeological methods and the application of interdisciplinary approaches combining archaeology, geology, botany, and remote sensing, that the full picture of Cahokia began to emerge. The advent of radiocarbon dating allowed archaeologists to establish precise chronological frameworks for the construction and occupation of the site. The development of remote sensing techniques, including aerial photography and ground-penetrating radar, allowed archaeologists to detect subsurface features, including buried mounds, house foundations, and palisade trenches that were not visible on the surface. The application of paleoecological methods, including the analysis of pollen, plant macrofossils, and animal bones, allowed archaeologists to reconstruct the environment and the economy of the Cahokian period in unprecedented detail. These methodological advances transformed the study of Cahokia from a descriptive exercise into an analytical one, allowing scholars to ask and answer questions about the causes of Cahokia's rise and fall that earlier generations of archaeologists had not been able to address. The work of the archaeologist Timothy Pauketat has been particularly influential in shaping modern understanding of Cahokia. Pauketat's research, based on decades of fieldwork in the American bottom and on a careful reanalysis of earlier excavation data, has advanced the thesis that Cahokia was not merely a large village that grew organically over time, but a planned city, deliberately founded as a new kind of political and religious community. Pauketat's work has also emphasized the role of religion and ritual in the founding and the maintenance of the Cahokian system, arguing that the monumental architecture, the astronomical alignments, and the ceremonial practices documented at the site were not merely reflections of political power, but constitutive of it, the means by which political authority was created, maintained, and, eventually, lost. Pauketat's thesis, presented in a series of influential books and articles published from the 1990s onward, drew on a meticulous analysis of the archaeological evidence from the early phases of the Cahokian occupation. He documented the sudden appearance of a new ceramic style, the construction of the first monumental mounds, the laying out of the Grand Plaza, and the influx of population from surrounding regions, all occurring within a narrow time frame that was too compressed to be explained by gradual organic growth. He argued that the founding of Cahokia was a deliberate act of political and religious creation the work of a leader or a group of leaders who envisioned a new kind of community and who possessed the charisma and the organizational skill to bring that vision into being. The thesis was controversial, challenging the prevailing view that complex societies emerge gradually through incremental processes of population growth and institutional development, but it was supported by the evidence, and it has become one of the most widely discussed and most influential interpretations of Cahokian origins. Other scholars, including the archaeologists Thomas Emerson and John Kelly, have contributed equally important insights into the nature and the functioning of Cahokian society. Emerson's work on the figurative art and ritual objects of the Cahokian tradition has revealed a rich symbolic world in which supernatural beings, cosmic forces, and political authority were intimately connected, a world in which the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was fluid, and in which the leaders of the community derived their authority from their perceived ability to communicate with the spiritual realm. Kelly's work on the spatial organization and the chronological development of the Cahokian site has provided the detailed stratigraphic and architectural data on which modern interpretations of Cahokian history depend. The numbers are striking when we survey the broader impact of Cahokia on the Mississippian world. Cahokia was not merely a large settlement, it was the center of a cultural system known to archaeologists as the Mississippian tradition that spread across the eastern half of the North American continent during the centuries of Cahokia's floruit. Mississippian sites, characterized by platform mounds, shell-tempered pottery, intensive maize agriculture, and a shared iconographic system known as the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, have been found from Wisconsin to Florida, from Oklahoma to North Carolina, covering an area of more than 2 million square kilometers. The spread of Mississippian culture was not a military conquest. It was a cultural expansion, driven by the diffusion of ideas, technologies, religious beliefs, and social practices that originated at or were channeled through Cahokia. The influence of Cahokia on the development of complex society in eastern North America was comparable, in its geographic scope and its cultural depth, to the influence of great cities in other parts of the world. The influence of Rome on the Mediterranean, of Chang'an on East Asia, of Teotihuacan on Mesoamerica. The comparison is not hyperbolic. It is a sober assessment of the archaeological evidence, and it places Cahokia among the most influential urban centers in the pre-modern world. Let us now consider the broader pattern of urban emergence and collapse in the pre-Columbian Americas. For Cahokia was not the only complex society in the ancient New World that rose to prominence and then disappeared. The Maya civilization of Mesoamerica provides one of the most extensively studied parallels. The Maya built cities of monumental architecture, developed sophisticated writing and mathematical systems, and organized complex hierarchical societies in the tropical lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula and adjacent regions. At their peak, Maya cities like Tikal, Calakmul, and Copan supported populations of tens of thousands. And then, during the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, roughly a century before Cahokia's rise, the Maya cities of the southern lowlands were abandoned in what archaeologists call the classic Maya collapse, a process of depopulation and institutional disintegration that has been attributed to a combination of drought, warfare, environmental degradation, and political fragmentation. The parallels with Cahokia are striking. Both societies were dependent on intensive maize agriculture. Both were organized around monumental ceremonial centers. Both experienced a rapid decline that has been attributed, at least in part, to environmental factors. And both left behind monumental ruins that testified to achievements that their successors could not replicate. At Chaco Canyon in the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built a complex of great houses, multi-story stone buildings containing hundreds of rooms, connected by a network of formal roads that extended across the desert for dozens of kilometers. The great houses were built between approximately 900 and 1150 of the Common Era, roughly contemporary with Cahokia, and they represented the highest expression of ancestral Puebloan architectural achievement. The largest of the great houses, Pueblo Bonito, contained more than 600 rooms and rose to 4 or 5 stories in places, a feat of masonry construction that demonstrates a level of engineering skill and organizational capacity comparable to anything in the contemporary world. More than 200,000 timber beams, many of them weighing hundreds of kilograms, were transported from forests more than 70 kilometers distant, a logistical achievement accomplished without wheeled vehicles or draft animals. By the late 1200s, Chaco Canyon was abandoned, its great houses standing empty, its roads unused, its population dispersed to other locations across the southwest. The causes of the abandonment have been attributed to drought, deforestation, and the exhaustion of local resources, a pattern of environmental degradation that closely parallels the theories proposed for Cahokia's decline. The parallel is made even more striking by the chronological overlap between the two civilizations, with both flourishing during the 11th and 12th centuries, and both declining during the 13th, a period of widespread environmental stress across much of North America. The Wari and Tiwanaku empires of the South American Andes provide another set of parallels. Both empires flourished during the first millennium of the Common Era. Both built monumental architecture and organized complex political systems, and both collapsed during the 11th and 12th centuries, leaving behind ruins that testified to a level of political and architectural achievement that was not matched in the region until the rise of the Inca Empire several centuries later. The Wari collapse, like the collapse of Cahokia, has been attributed to a combination of internal political factors and environmental stress, including drought and the disruption of agricultural systems. The Maya civilization of Mesoamerica provides one of the most extensively studied parallels. The Maya built cities of monumental architecture, developed sophisticated writing and mathematical systems, and organized complex hierarchical societies in the tropical lowlands of the Yucatan Peninsula and adjacent regions. At their peak, Maya cities like Tikal, Calakmul, and Copan supported populations of tens of thousands and were connected by trade networks, political alliances, and ceremonial traditions that spanned the entire Maya region. And then, during the 9th and 10th centuries of the Common Era, roughly a century before Cahokia's rise, the Maya cities of the southern lowlands were abandoned in what archaeologists call the classic Maya collapse, a process of depopulation and institutional disintegration that has been attributed to a combination of drought, warfare, environmental degradation, and political fragmentation. The parallels with Cahokia are striking. Both societies were dependent on intensive maize agriculture. Both were organized around monumental ceremonial centers. Both experienced a rapid decline that has been attributed, at least in part, to environmental factors. And both left behind monumental ruins that testified to achievements that their successors could not replicate. The pattern that emerges from these comparisons is one of cyclical emergence and decline, of complex societies that rise, flourish, and then collapse, often within a period of a few centuries, leaving behind physical monuments, but no living institutions, no functioning social structures, no continuous cultural traditions that connect them to the societies that follow. The pattern is not unique to the Americas. It is found in every part of the world where complex societies have existed, from the Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean to the medieval kingdoms of Southeast Asia to the city-states of East Africa. But the pattern is particularly striking in the Americas, where the absence of written records means that the internal perspectives of these societies, their own understanding of what was happening to them and why, are lost to us forever. The silence of these civilizations is not merely an absence of information, it is a wound in the historical record, a gap that can never be fully filled, a loss that compounds the original loss of the civilizations themselves. The relationship between Cahokia and the Mississippian chiefdoms that the first European explorers encountered in the 16th century provides a final, poignant coda to the story of Cahokia's influence. When the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto marched through the southeast from 1539 to 1542, he encountered a series of Mississippian chiefdoms that were organized around mound centers, that practiced intensive maize agriculture, that maintained hierarchical political structures with paramount chiefs and subordinate towns, and that displayed elements of the ceremonial tradition that had originated at Cahokia centuries earlier. De Soto's accounts describe fortified towns with mound platforms. Chiefs carried on litters, elaborate ceremonial displays, and large, well-organized populations that were capable of fielding thousands of warriors. The chiefdoms that De Soto encountered were the heirs of the Mississippian tradition that Cahokia had catalyzed, communities that had inherited the cultural legacy of the great city on the Mississippi, even if they no longer remembered its name or its location. The irony is cruel. By the time Europeans arrived in the Mississippi Valley in sufficient numbers to record what they saw, Cahokia had been abandoned for more than 2 centuries. The Mississippian chiefdoms that the Europeans encountered were already in decline, weakened by the diseases that the Europeans brought with them, and by the social disruption that followed in the wake of European contact. Within a century of De Soto's expedition, the Mississippian chiefdoms of the southeast had been devastated by epidemic disease, by warfare, and by the forced removal of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. The cultural tradition that had begun at Cahokia, the tradition of mound building, maize agriculture, and ceremonial complexity that had shaped the development of complex society in eastern North America for more than 5 centuries, was shattered by the forces that European colonization unleashed. The deeper truth about Cahokia is that it challenges the most fundamental assumptions that American culture has made about the history and the capacity of the indigenous peoples of North America. For more than 4 centuries, from the arrival of the first European colonists to the present day, the dominant narrative of American history has been built on the assumption that the indigenous peoples of North America were nomadic hunters and gatherers, living in small dispersed bands, lacking the skills and the inclination for agriculture, for urbanization, for the construction of permanent settlements, and for the organization of complex societies. This assumption was central to the ideology of colonialism because it provided the moral and legal justification for the dispossession of indigenous peoples from their land. If the indigenous peoples had not developed the land, had not built cities on it, had not cultivated it, and improved it according to European standards, then they had no legitimate claim to it, and the European settlers were entitled to take it and use it as they saw fit. Cahokia demolishes this assumption. Here was a city built by indigenous North Americans that was larger than most contemporary European cities, that was organized around a planned urban center with monumental architecture and astronomical alignments, that was sustained by intensive agriculture on some of the richest soil in North America, and that was the hub of a trade network that spanned half a continent. The people who built Cahokia were not nomadic hunters and gatherers. They were farmers, architects, engineers, astronomers, priests, traders, and rulers, people who possessed the full range of skills and capabilities that are associated with urban civilization in any part of the world. The existence of Cahokia is an irrefutable demonstration that the indigenous peoples of North America were capable of building complex, urbanized societies, and that the failure to recognize this capacity was not a failure of the indigenous peoples, but a failure of the Europeans who encountered them and of the scholars who studied them. The achievement of the Cahokians is made even more remarkable by the fact that it was accomplished without many of the technologies that the Old World civilizations relied upon, without writing, without the wheel, without draft animals, without metallurgy, without stone masonry. Everything at Cahokia was built with earth, wood, thatch, and human hands. The monumentality of the achievement was not diminished by the modesty of the materials. It was enhanced by it because it demonstrates that human organizational capacity, not technological sophistication, is the true foundation of civilizational achievement. Let that sink in. This is not science fiction. It is documented archaeology, confirmed by decades of excavation, analysis, and peer-reviewed publication. The mounds of Cahokia are still there, visible, measurable, open to the public. The artifacts from the site are housed in museums and university collections across the country. The radiocarbon dates have been confirmed by multiple independent laboratories. The evidence is overwhelming, unambiguous, and freely available to anyone who cares to examine it. And yet the dominant narrative of American history continues to marginalize the achievements of the indigenous peoples who built Cahokia, treating them as an anomaly, a footnote, a curiosity, rather than as a central chapter in the story of human civilization on the North American continent. The mound builder myth, the claim that the mounds of the Mississippi Valley were built not by the ancestors of the indigenous peoples, but by a lost race of mysterious origin, persisted in American popular culture well into the 19th century, and its legacy continues to shape public perception of indigenous North American civilizations to the present day. The myth emerged in the late 18th and early 19th centuries as European settlers moved into the Ohio and Mississippi valleys and encountered the thousands of earthen mounds that dotted the landscape. The settlers were impressed by the scale and the regularity of the mounds, but they were unwilling to attribute their construction to the ancestors of the indigenous peoples whom they were in the process of dispossessing. The attribution of the mounds to a lost race served a dual purpose. It satisfied the settlers' curiosity about the origin of the mounds, and it reinforced the ideological framework that justified the dispossession of indigenous peoples, by implying that the indigenous peoples were not the original inhabitants of the land, but latecomers who had destroyed or displaced a more advanced civilization. The candidates proposed for the identity of the mound builders were numerous and varied. Some writers suggested the ancient Israelites, drawing on the theory that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. Others proposed the Phoenicians, the Egyptians, the Vikings, the Welsh, or the Hindus, attributing the mounds to virtually every known civilization, except the one that had actually built them. The myth was propagated by popular books, magazine articles, and public lectures that presented the mound builder theory as established fact, and that speculated freely about the civilization that had supposedly built the mounds and the catastrophe that had supposedly destroyed it. The myth was so widely believed and so culturally embedded that it took decades of sustained scholarly effort to debunk it. The debunking was accomplished primarily by Cyrus Thomas of the Smithsonian Institution, whose comprehensive survey of mound sites across the eastern United States, published in 1894 as part of the annual report of the Bureau of Ethnology, demonstrated conclusively that the mounds were the work of the ancestors of the indigenous peoples of the region. Thomas's evidence was overwhelming. He showed that the artifacts found in the mounds were identical in style and material to artifacts known to have been produced by indigenous peoples in the historical period. He showed that the mound building tradition had continued in some parts of the southeast into the period of European contact, with Spanish and French explorers providing eyewitness descriptions of mound-building ceremonies, and he showed that the distribution and the style of the mounds were consistent with the known cultural geography of the indigenous peoples of the eastern woodlands, not with any hypothetical lost civilization from the Old World. Thomas's findings were accepted by the scholarly community, but they never fully penetrated the popular imagination, where the idea of a mysterious lost civilizations continued to circulate in one form or another, evolving from the mound builder myth into more recent variants that attribute the achievements of ancient indigenous peoples to extraterrestrial visitors, lost Atlanteans, or other fantasy scenarios, rather than crediting the people themselves. The persistence of these myths, despite the overwhelming evidence against them, is itself a subject worthy of study, because it reveals the depth of the cultural resistance to the idea that indigenous peoples were capable of the same kinds of civilizational achievements as the peoples of the Old World. The myths are not harmless fantasies. They are expressions of a worldview that denies indigenous peoples their history, their achievements, and their humanity. And they continue to circulate in popular culture, in books, on television, and on the internet, reaching audiences of millions and perpetuating the erasure that the scholarly community rejected more than a century ago. Something is wrong with our assumptions about the history of North America, and the wrongness is not accidental. It is systematic, rooted in the ideological foundations of the colonial project, and perpetuated by the educational and cultural institutions that have inherited those foundations. The history that most Americans learn in school begins with Columbus, as though the continent had no history before the arrival of Europeans. The indigenous peoples are introduced as a backdrop, a landscape feature, a part of the natural environment that the European settlers encountered and transformed. Their civilizations, their cities, their monuments, their trade networks, their astronomical knowledge, their political institutions. All of this is either ignored or minimized, treated as a minor prelude to the main event, which is the history of European colonization and the creation of the United States. Cahokia does not fit this narrative, and the narrative has dealt with Cahokia by the simplest possible method, by leaving it out. Let that sink in. The consequences of this erasure are not merely academic, they are political, cultural, and deeply personal. The marginalization of Cahokia in the American historical narrative is part of a larger pattern of erasure that has denied indigenous peoples recognition for their achievements, credit for their contributions, and respect for their cultural heritage. If the history of North America began with Columbus, then the indigenous peoples who lived on the continent for thousands of years before his arrival are rendered historically invisible, their civilizations treated as though they never existed, their achievements dismissed as irrelevant to the story of America. Cahokia is a corrective to this erasure, a physical monument to the reality that the history of North America is much older, much richer, and much more complex than the standard narrative allows. The mounds of Cahokia are not footnotes. They are chapters in a story that has been systematically suppressed, and that is only now beginning to be told. The modern descendants of the Mississippian peoples, the indigenous nations of the Southeast and the Midwest, have their own relationships with Cahokia and with the legacy it represents. For many indigenous communities, Cahokia is a place of ancestral significance, a site that connects them to a past that has been denied and suppressed by the dominant culture. The recognition of Cahokia as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, the growing scholarly attention to the site's significance, and the increasing public awareness of Cahokia's existence are all encouraging developments. But they are insufficient to undo centuries of erasure and marginalization. The story of Cahokia is not merely a story about the past. It is a story about the present, about the ongoing struggle of indigenous peoples to have their history recognized, their achievements acknowledged, and their cultural heritage respected. The relationship between the archaeological study of Cahokia and the interests and perspectives of indigenous communities is an evolving and sometimes contentious one. In recent years, indigenous scholars and community members have played an increasingly active role in the interpretation and presentation of the Cahokian story, bringing perspectives and priorities that differ in important ways from those of the academic archaeologists who have traditionally dominated the field. Indigenous perspectives on Cahokia tend to emphasize the continuity between the Cahokian past and the indigenous present, the connections between the beliefs, the practices, and the social structures of the Mississippian world and the beliefs, practices, and social structures of contemporary indigenous communities. This emphasis on continuity challenges the assumption, common in earlier archaeological writing, that Cahokia was a dead end, a failed experiment that left no lasting legacy, and it replaces that assumption with a more nuanced understanding of the ways in which the Cahokian tradition has persisted, transformed but recognizable in the cultural life of the indigenous peoples who are its heirs. The question of whether the people of Cahokia chose to abandon their city or were forced to leave it by circumstances beyond their control is one of the most philosophically interesting questions raised by the Cahokian evidence. The anthropologist James Scott has argued, in his studies of stateless peoples in Southeast Asia, that the choice to live outside the reach of the state, to reject centralized authority and the demands it imposes, is itself a form of political agency, a deliberate decision to prioritize autonomy over the benefits that state membership provides. If the people of Cahokia chose to leave their city, if they weighed the costs of remaining, the declining harvests, the increasing demands of the elite, the growing social tensions, the deteriorating environment, against the benefits of dispersal, the freedom, the autonomy, the opportunity to establish new communities organized on less hierarchical principles, and decided that dispersal was preferable, then the abandonment of Cahokia was not a failure. It was a judgment, a collective decision that the costs of complexity had exceeded its benefits, a decision that reflects a kind of practical wisdom about the limits of centralized authority and the value of individual and communal autonomy. This interpretation is speculative, of course. We cannot know what the people of Cahokia were thinking when they left their city, because they left no record of their thoughts. But the interpretation is consistent with the evidence, and it offers a perspective on the Cahokian story that is more nuanced and more respectful of the agency of the indigenous peoples involved than the conventional narrative of collapse and failure. The people of Cahokia were not victims of forces beyond their control. They were agents of their own history, people who made choices based on their assessment of their circumstances and their understanding of their options. Their choice to leave the city may have been the wisest choice available to them, a recognition that the system they had built, for all its achievements, had reached its limits, and that the best response to that recognition was not to struggle to preserve a failing system, but to move on, to start again, to build something new in a new place. The deeper truth extends beyond the politics of historical memory. Cahokia also raises profound questions about the nature of urban life and the conditions under which cities emerge, flourish, and fail. The conventional wisdom about urbanization, derived primarily from the study of cities in the Old World, holds that cities emerge as a consequence of agricultural intensification, population growth, and the development of centralized political institutions capable of organizing and administering large, concentrated populations. Cahokia is consistent with this model in some respects: its agricultural foundation, its concentrated population, its centralized authority, but it diverges from the model in others. Cahokia had no writing system. It had no money or standardized medium of exchange. It had no professional standing army, though it clearly had the capacity for organized violence. It had no stone architecture, no city walls in the conventional sense, and no permanent infrastructure beyond the earthen mounds and the wooden palisade that defined its ceremonial center. By the standards of Old World urbanization, Cahokia was an anomaly, a city that possessed some of the features associated with urban life but lacked others, a city that was unmistakably urban in its scale and its complexity, but that organized itself in ways that did not conform to the templates derived from the study of Mesopotamia, Egypt, or Rome. The anomalous character of Cahokian urbanism is not a deficiency of Cahokia. It is a deficiency of the models, which were designed to describe one particular form of urbanization, and which are inadequate to the task of describing the full range of urban forms that have existed in human history. Cahokia was a city. It was a different kind of city from Ur or Memphis or Athens, but it was a city nonetheless, a large, concentrated, socially complex settlement that organized thousands of people into a functioning urban community. The fact that it did so without writing, without money, without stone architecture, and without many of the other features that the Old World models consider essential demonstrates that the prerequisites for urbanization are fewer and more flexible than those models suggest, and that the human capacity for urban life is broader and more diverse than the European experience alone can reveal. The recent work of the archaeologist A.J. White and his colleagues has added yet another dimension to the Cahokian story. Analysis of sediment cores from a lake adjacent to the Cahokia site has revealed evidence of a major flood event in the late 1200s that may have inundated portions of the city and contributed to its abandonment. The flood, one of the largest in the recorded geological history of the American bottom, would have devastated agricultural fields, destroyed residential structures, contaminated water supplies, and displaced a significant portion of the population. Coming on top of the droughts, the deforestation, the social tensions, and the declining authority of the elite, a major flood could have been the final catastrophe that tipped the balance from a declining city to an abandoned one. The cumulative weight of the evidence suggests that no single factor explains the collapse of Cahokia. The city was brought down not by a single cause, but by a cascade of mutually reinforcing factors: environmental, climatic, social, and political, that converged during the 12th and 13th centuries to undermine the foundations of the Cahokian system. The environmental degradation weakened the agricultural base. The droughts reduced the surplus. The declining surplus undermined the authority of the elite. The weakened authority reduced the capacity for collective action. The reduced capacity for collective action made it harder to respond to environmental challenges. And the cycle continued, each factor amplifying the effects of the others, until the system could no longer sustain itself and the population dispersed. This pattern of cascading collapse is not unique to Cahokia. It has been identified by scholars of civilizational decline, most notably by the archaeologist Joseph Tainter, as a general feature of the collapse of complex societies. Tainter argued that complex societies invest increasing amounts of energy and resources in maintaining their organizational structures, and that these investments eventually reach a point of diminishing returns, after which simplification, the reduction of complexity, becomes the rational response. The Cahokian case fits this pattern well. The construction of the mounds, the maintenance of the palisade, the organization of the trade networks, the performance of the ceremonies, the support of the elite, all of these required investments of energy and resources that the Cahokian population could sustain during the period of favorable climate and agricultural abundance that characterized the 11th and early 12th centuries, but that became increasingly burdensome as conditions deteriorated and surpluses declined. The abandonment of Cahokia was, in Tainter's terms, an act of simplification, a rational response to a situation in which the costs of maintaining complexity had exceeded its benefits. What does Cahokia mean for our understanding of North American history, of urbanization, and of the human capacity to build, sustain, and ultimately destroy complex societies? The question deserves more than a summary answer, because the implications of Cahokia extend far beyond the specific details of the archaeological record and touch on fundamental assumptions about who we are, where we have been, and what we are capable of achieving. The first and most direct implication is that the history of North America is profoundly different from the history that most Americans have been taught. The standard narrative of American history, the narrative that begins with Columbus and moves through colonial settlement, revolution, westward expansion, industrialization, and the creation of a global superpower, is not false. But it is radically incomplete because it omits the thousands of years of indigenous history that preceded European contact and that created the landscapes, the ecosystems, and the cultural traditions that the European settlers encountered when they arrived. Cahokia is a reminder that the continent that Columbus reached in 1492 was not a wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was a landscape that had been shaped by thousands of years of human habitation, a landscape that bore the marks of agriculture, urbanization, and deliberate environmental management on a scale that the European newcomers failed to recognize or refuse to acknowledge. The second implication concerns the nature of complexity itself. The dominant models of social complexity, derived from the study of the Old World civilizations, emphasize the role of writing, metallurgy, and centralized bureaucratic administration in the organization and maintenance of complex societies. Cahokia challenges these models by demonstrating that a society of considerable complexity, with monumental architecture, long-distance trade networks, astronomical knowledge, and a hierarchically organized population of thousands, can exist without any of these features. The Cahokians did not write. They did not smelt metal. They did not maintain a bureaucratic administration in any form that has left traces in the archaeological record. And yet they built a city, organized a society, and sustained a civilization for 3 centuries. Their achievement demonstrates that the prerequisites for social complexity are fewer and more flexible than the Old World models suggest, and that the human capacity for complex social organization can express itself in forms that do not conform to the templates derived from the study of Mesopotamia, Egypt, or China. The absence of writing at Cahokia is particularly significant for what it reveals about the nature of institutional memory and the transmission of knowledge across generations. In the Old World civilizations, writing served as the technology of institutional memory. the mechanism by which laws, records, histories, and religious texts were preserved and transmitted from one generation to the next. Without writing, the Cahokians must have relied entirely on oral transmission, on the memory of individuals and the performance of communal rituals to preserve and transmit the knowledge, the beliefs, and the organizational principles on which their society depended. The fact that they succeeded in maintaining a complex, urbanized society for 3 centuries through oral transmission alone is a testimony to the power and the reliability of oral tradition as a vehicle for cultural continuity. But it is also a tragedy, because the oral tradition that sustained the Cahokian system was disrupted by the same processes of decline and dispersal that emptied the city, and the knowledge that it contained, the stories, the laws, the religious doctrines, the historical memories that had been passed from mouth to ear for 10 or 12 generations, was lost with it. The modern world tends to underestimate the capacity of oral traditions to preserve complex information over long periods of time. Studies of oral cultures around the world have demonstrated that oral traditions can maintain remarkable accuracy over centuries, transmitting genealogies, historical narratives, legal codes, and religious doctrines with a fidelity that rivals that of written records. The Aboriginal Australians maintained oral traditions that accurately described geological events, including volcanic eruptions and changes in sea level that occurred more than 7,000 years ago. The oral traditions of Polynesian navigators preserved the knowledge of ocean currents, star positions, and island locations that made possible the colonization of the entire Pacific basin. The capacity of the human mind to preserve and transmit information without writing is far greater than most literate people imagine, and the people of Cahokia almost certainly possessed a rich, detailed, and sophisticated body of oral tradition that encompassed their history, their beliefs, their laws, and their understanding of the world they inhabited. That tradition is gone, irretrievably lost, and its loss is one of the most painful dimensions of the Cahokian story. The third implication is environmental, and it carries particular resonance in the modern world. If the decline of Cahokia was driven in part by environmental degradation, by the depletion of soils, the clearing of forests, and the exhaustion of natural resources, then the Cahokian story is a cautionary tale about the consequences of unsustainable land use, a warning that even the most productive environments can be degraded by human activity, and that the degradation can have catastrophic consequences for the societies that depend on them. The American bottom, one of the most fertile and most resilient agricultural environments in North America, was apparently unable to sustain the demands of the Cahokian population indefinitely. If this is true, then no environment is immune to the consequences of overuse, and the modern assumption that technological innovation will always outpace environmental degradation is, at best, an untested hypothesis. The environmental dimension of the Cahokian story has gained urgency in recent decades, as the consequences of modern industrial agriculture, deforestation, and resource extraction have become increasingly visible and increasingly alarming. The Mississippi Valley, the landscape that sustained Cahokia 1,000 years ago, is today one of the most intensively farmed regions on Earth, and the environmental consequences of that intensive farming, including soil erosion, nutrient depletion, water pollution, and habitat destruction, are well documented and deeply concerning. The dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, a vast area of oxygen-depleted water caused by agricultural runoff from the Mississippi River basin, is one of the most dramatic examples of the environmental cost of modern agriculture. A cost that the Cahokians, with their comparatively modest demands on the landscape, would not have recognized, but that their modern successors are only beginning to confront. The parallel between the Cahokian experience and the modern one is not exact, but it is instructive, a reminder that the relationship between human societies and their environments is always dynamic, always reciprocal, and always subject to the possibility of collapse when the demands of the society exceed the capacity of the environment to sustain them. The fourth implication concerns the preservation of Cahokia itself, which is both a remarkable success story and a continuing challenge. The Cahokia Mounds State Historic Site established by the state of Illinois in 1979 and designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982, protects the core of the ancient city, including Monk's Mound, the Grand Plaza, and approximately 70 of the original mounds. The designation was a landmark achievement, placing Cahokia alongside the pyramids of Egypt, the Parthenon of Athens, and the ancient city of Rome as one of the most important archaeological sites in the world. But the protection is incomplete. Many of the original mounds have been destroyed by urban development, road construction, and agricultural activity in the centuries since the site was abandoned. Of the more than 120 mounds that originally existed at Cahokia, roughly 80 survive in recognizable form, and many of these have been damaged by erosion, vandalism, or encroachment. The residential areas that surrounded the monumental core of the city are largely unprotected, lying beneath the highways, the shopping centers, and the residential neighborhoods of the modern St. Louis metropolitan area. Every year, development activity in the American bottom destroys archaeological deposits that can never be replaced, narrowing the window through which future generations will be able to study and understand the Cahokian past. There is a pause that occurs at this point, a moment of reflection that transcends the specific facts of the Cahokian case and reaches towards something more universal. The people of Cahokia built something remarkable. They organized thousands of individuals into a functioning urban community. They constructed earthen monuments that have endured for more than a millennium. They developed a ceremonial and astronomical tradition of genuine sophistication. They sustained their community for 3 centuries, a span of time that encompasses the entire history of the United States from independence to the present. And then they lost it. The system that they had built, the city that they had raised from the floodplain of the Mississippi, the society that they had organized and maintained for 10 or 12 generations, came apart, and the people who had invested so much in its construction and its maintenance walked away from it and did not return. The act of walking away is itself worthy of reflection. The people of Cahokia did not perish in their city. They did not die defending its walls. They did not succumb to plague or famine in numbers that emptied the streets. They left. They made a decision, collective or individual, conscious or gradual, to abandon the city that their ancestors had built and to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The decision to leave a city is a decision of profound significance, because it represents a judgment that the costs of remaining have exceeded the benefits, that the social contract that bound the community together has broken down, that the institutions and the traditions that once sustained the community are no longer capable of doing so. The abandonment of Cahokia was not merely a demographic event, it was a judgment, rendered by the people who lived there, on the system that governed their lives. Why? What happened? What went wrong? These are the questions that Cahokia presses upon us. And they are questions that we cannot fully answer, because the people who could have answered them left no written record of their experience. We have the mounds, we have the artifacts, we have the burials, we have the evidence of trade and ceremony and construction and conflict, but we do not have the voices of the people who lived through the rise and the fall of Cahokia, the people who built the mounds and worshipped in the plazas and traded the shell and the copper and the mica, the people who watched the sunrise on the equinox from the observation point at Woodhenge and knew that the world was turning and that the cycle would begin again. Their silence is not an absence of meaning. It is a presence of loss, a reminder that every civilization, no matter how powerful, no matter how enduring, no matter how monumental, is ultimately mortal, that the structures outlast the people and the meaning outlasts neither. The Cahokian case raises a question that applies to every civilization that has ever existed, including our own. How do we know when a system has reached its limits? How do we recognize the signs of decline when we are embedded in the system that is declining? The people of Cahokia did not wake up one morning and decide that their civilization was over. The decline was gradual, spread across decades or centuries, experienced not as a single dramatic event, but as a slow, cumulative erosion of the conditions that had made the city possible. The droughts came and went. The harvests declined. The forests shrank. The tensions increased. The ceremonies continued, but they no longer held the community together with the same force. The authority of the rulers weakened, the population dispersed, and at some point the city was empty, the mounds standing alone in the floodplain, monuments to an achievement that the builders themselves may not have recognized as endangered until it was too late to save. The pattern of cascading decline, in which multiple factors reinforce each other in a feedback loop of deterioration, is perhaps the most important lesson that the Cahokian story offers to the modern world. The modern world faces its own cascading challenges: climate change, resource depletion, biodiversity loss, social inequality, political polarization, challenges that interact with and amplify each other in ways that make them more difficult to address individually. The Cahokian experience suggests that cascading decline is not merely a theoretical possibility, but a historical reality, a pattern that has repeated itself in multiple civilizations, across multiple continents and multiple millennia. The recognition of this pattern is itself a form of knowledge, a warning derived from the accumulated experience of human civilizations that have confronted similar challenges and failed to overcome them. The question is whether the modern world is capable of learning from that experience, of recognizing the signs of cascading decline while there is still time to reverse them, or whether we, like the people of Cahokia, will recognize the danger only when it is too late to act. And so we come to the American bottom, to the broad flood plain where the Mississippi carries the waters of half a continent toward the Gulf of Mexico, to the place where a civilization was born and died, and was forgotten, and is now, slowly and incompletely, being remembered. The mounds are still there. They have been there for more than 1,000 years, standing in the fields, covered with grass, surrounded by the highways and the strip malls and the industrial parks of the St. Louis metropolitan area. Monk's Mound rises from the floodplain like a hill that was never supposed to be there, too regular in its shape, too symmetrical in its proportions, too precisely oriented to the cardinal directions to be a natural feature of the landscape. It is a monument, built by human hands, carrying the weight of 1,000 years of silence on its broad, grassy terraces. The silence of Cahokia is different from the silence of other lost civilizations. The Egyptians left their hieroglyphs. The Maya left their glyphs. The Romans left their inscriptions and their literature and their laws. Even the Etruscans, whose language remains only partially understood, left inscriptions that preserve the sounds of their speech and the outlines of their thoughts. The Cahokians left nothing of the kind. They had no writing system. They left no inscriptions. They left no texts. They left only the mounds and the artifacts and the bones and the silence that envelops them all. A silence that is absolute and irreversible, because the technology that could have preserved their voices, the technology of writing, was a technology they never developed or chose not to develop, and the oral traditions that may have preserved their stories were disrupted by the same processes of decline and dispersal that emptied the city. What we know about Cahokia, we know from the ground. We know it from the soil layers that record the phases of mound construction. We know it from the potholes that mark the locations of the wooden posts of Woodhenge. We know it from the burials that reveal the extremes of wealth and power that characterize Cahokian society. We know it from the pottery and the projectile points and the copper ornaments and the shell beads that testify to the trade networks that connected Cahokia to communities across the continent. We know it from the charred remains of maize cobs that tell us what the people ate. We know it from the bones of animals that tell us what they hunted. We know it from the chemical analysis of human remains that tells us where the people came from and what they ate and how they lived and how they died. We know a great deal about the material conditions of Cahokian life, and we know almost nothing about the immaterial conditions, the beliefs, the values, the fears, the hopes, the stories that gave meaning to the material conditions. And that motivated the extraordinary effort that the construction of the mounds and the organization of the city required. The people of Cahokia carried more than 600,000 cubic meters of earth in woven baskets to build Monk's Mound. They carried it one basket at a time, on their backs, up the growing slope, and dumped it where the supervisors indicated, and then went back for another load. They did this day after day, year after year, generation after generation, for 3 centuries. The scale of the effort is almost incomprehensible. The dedication that it required is beyond anything that the modern world, with its machines and its fossil fuels and its labor-saving technologies, is asked to imagine. The people who carried those baskets believed in what they were building. They believed it with a conviction that was strong enough to sustain them through decades of back-breaking labor, strong enough to motivate them to subordinate their individual interests to the collective goal of raising a mountain from a floodplain. We do not know what that belief was. We do not know what they thought they were building, or why they thought it was important, or what they expected to happen when it was finished. We know only that they did it, and that what they built has outlasted them by 1,000 years. The sun rises over the American bottom, and the light catches the terraces of Monk's Mound. And for a moment the mound looks as it must have looked 1,000 years ago, when the city was alive, when the plazas were filled with people, when the smoke of cooking fires rose from thousands of houses, when the ceremonial drums echoed across the floodplain, when the chief stood on the summit of the great mound and looked out over the city that he ruled, and the land that fed it, and the river that connected it to the world. For a moment the past is present, and the silence yields to the imagined sounds of a living city. And then the moment passes, and the mound is just a mound again, a hill of grass and earth, standing in a field on the outskirts of East St. Louis, visited by school children and archaeologists, and the occasional tourist who has heard, somehow, that there is something here worth seeing. There is something here worth seeing. There is something here worth knowing. There is something here worth remembering. The people of Cahokia built a city in the heart of North America 1,000 years ago, using nothing but their hands and their ingenuity and their faith in whatever it was they believed. They built it, they lived in it, they worshipped in it, they traded through it, they ruled from it, and then they left it behind, and the grass grew over the mounds, and the trees grew over the palisade, and the river flooded the plazas, and the memory of the city faded until there was no one left who remembered it had ever existed. If you visit Cahokia today, you will find a state historic site on the outskirts of Collinsville, Illinois, a few kilometers from the sprawl of East St. Louis. There is a museum, an interpretive center, and a series of walking trails that led through the mound complex. You can climb the long staircase that ascends the western face of Monk's Mound, rising through the grass to the broad flat summit where a great building once stood. From the top you can look out across the American bottom, across the flat, green expanse of the floodplain, toward the modern skyline of St. Louis, on the far bank of the Mississippi. You can see the ghost of the Grand Plaza, now a grassy field bordered by smaller mounds. You can imagine the city as it was, the wooden houses clustered in neighborhoods around the central precinct, the palisade encircling the sacred core, the smoke rising from thousands of cooking fires, the sound of drums and voices carrying across the floodplain. You can imagine the ceremonies that brought the community together, the games that entertained them, the arguments that divided them, the fears that haunted them, and the ambitions that drove them to raise a mountain of earth from a river floodplain using nothing but baskets and human labor. The mounds remained, but the meaning was lost. The structures endured, but the stories did not. And now, 1,000 years later, the archaeologists dig in the earth, sifting the soil through screens, measuring the post holes, analyzing the pottery, counting the beads, reading the bones, trying to reconstruct from the fragments what the whole must have looked like, knowing that the reconstruction will always be incomplete, that the meaning will always be missing, that the silence of a civilization without writing is a silence that can never be fully broken. Cahokia stands in the American landscape as a reminder of everything we have lost and everything we have failed to see. It stands as a rebuke to the narratives that deny indigenous peoples the credit for their achievements. It stands as a warning about the fragility of even the most impressive human accomplishments. And it stands as a testament to the power and the persistence of the human desire to build, to organize, to create something that will outlast the builders, something that will stand in the earth and say, long after the builders are gone and their names and their language and their beliefs are forgotten, that they were here, that they mattered, that they built this, and that it endured. The mounds of Cahokia are not the only legacy of the people who built them. The Mississippian tradition that Cahokia catalyzed, the cultural system of mound building, maize agriculture, shell-tempered pottery, and shared ceremonial practice, persisted in the southeast for centuries after Cahokia's decline, transmitted to communities across the eastern woodlands that continued to build mounds, to cultivate maize, and to practice ceremonies that echoed the traditions of the great city on the Mississippi. The tradition reached communities as far away as the Gulf Coast of Florida, the Piedmont of Georgia, the river valleys of Alabama and Tennessee, and the prairies of Oklahoma, carrying with it architectural forms, artistic motifs, and ceremonial practices that bore the imprint of their Cahokian origin, even as they were adapted to the specific conditions of each new environment. When the Spanish explorer Hernando de Soto marched through the southeast in 1539 to 1542, he encountered Mississippian chiefdoms that still built mound centers, that still maintained hierarchical political structures, and that still practiced elements of the ceremonial tradition that had originated, or at least achieved its fullest expression, at Cahokia centuries earlier. The people that De Soto encountered did not know the name of Cahokia. They did not know that the tradition they practiced had begun in a great city on the Mississippi floodplain half a millennium earlier. But the tradition itself was alive, transmitted from generation to generation, community to community, across the centuries and across the landscape, a living link to a past that the people themselves could no longer name. The tradition connected them to Cahokia in ways that they could not articulate, and that the Spanish explorers, with their fixation on gold and conquest, could not begin to understand. That tradition is gone now, disrupted by the catastrophic consequences of European contact, by the epidemics that killed millions, by the wars that displaced entire peoples, by the forced removals that uprooted communities from their ancestral lands, and by the cultural suppression that sought to erase indigenous identity and replace it with European norms. The world that Cahokia helped to create, the Mississippian world of mound centers and chiefdoms and ceremonial plazas and long-distance trade, was shattered by the forces that European colonization unleashed, and the people who had inherited that world were denied the opportunity to tell their own story, to explain their own past, to take credit for their own achievements. The mounds remain, the people are gone, the meaning is lost, but the mounds remain, rising from the floodplain like the last words of a story that was never finished, a story that began 1,000 years ago when a group of people in the American bottom decided to build something that had never been built before, something that would transform the landscape and organize a society and reach across half a continent, something that would endure long after the builders were forgotten, standing in the earth as a silent, patient, unbreakable testimony to the fact that they were here, that they mattered, and that what they built was worth remembering. The silence of Cahokia is not an ending. It is an invitation, extended across 1,000 years of solitude, to look at the mounds, to see what they represent, and to understand that the history of this continent is older, deeper, and more extraordinary than any of us were ever taught.